webinar today, SQL Server 2016 New Features. I'm your presenter today. My name is Stephen Giles. I'm the Director of Data Platform Maturity at Dimensional Strategies. So to my mind, a mature data platform stands on three pillars. You have security, we have performance, and functionality. So security, as I said, is auditing, access control, data protection, and high availability. So let's dive into some of the new features specifically around the security pillar. Some very interesting new features that have come into 2016 around security, the advanced threat analytics. Auditing has been around for a while. Authentication is something we're all familiar with, but there's two new features that really are interesting. One is row-level security, and the other is dynamic data masking. There's always encrypted and transparent data encryption we've had since 2008, but it has been enhanced in 2016. So let's look at two specific features. So dynamic data masking allows me to determine what data gets displayed back to the user depending on who the user is. We can enable this on specific tables and specific columns, and when we run a query against those columns, the result sets we get back will be very different depending on who I am. So always encrypted is a new feature that's quite interesting, and what it allows me to do is it allows me to configure my database so that the data is encrypted from the point in time that it leaves the client. And the way this works, we put a library on the client side, and unfortunately to use this, we have to modify our applications. The app makes a call. The call has identifiable number here, in this case, social insurance number. The data, as it gets passed to the database, though, gets encrypted by the always encrypted library and actually gets sent encrypted across the wire and stored encrypted on the server. So the server never actually sees the unencrypted value. It only receives it as ciphertext. When it retrieves the records and brings them back, the always encrypted client decrypts it as the value comes in, so the clear text comes back to the end users. We also have some real increases in high availability and disaster recovery through always on. A few new features that have been added in 2016. For one, we can now have multiple synchronous replicas, whereas before we could only have one. We can have a high number of asynchronous replicas, and those replicas do not need to be close. The other thing they've added as well is the ability to create load balance sets across readable secondaries. So let's talk about the performance pillar now. There's a couple new features here I want to talk about. In-memory OLTP is a big one. Stretch database, then we'll talk about query store. Microsoft has incorporated both the column store index and the OLTP in-memory index together to allow me to essentially build covering tables all in RAM, and then I can run my real-time analytics against the in-memory index without impacting the performance on the server. Stretch database is also interesting as well. For situations where I have very big tables that are for the most part cold, I can actually stretch them into a lower cost storage, in this case Azure. So I can choose the table I want to stretch, I stretch it into the cloud, and SQL Server will actually keep the hot records close, send the cold records into Azure. From an end user perspective, there's absolutely no change. My apps will simply call the SQL Server the way they always have. SQL Server internally will figure out where the record I'm looking for is and will retrieve the appropriate records. The Microsoft Query Store is a very useful feature. With Query Store, what we can do is we actually can see the application of execution plans over time. I can see performance of those queries. So this is great if I want to find, for example, periodic slowdowns where I think two processes are in conflict, but I don't know what they are. So the last pillar is functionality. There's a number of new things here. Many of them are BI related. There is support for big data, built-in advanced analytics, and then the integration to cloud, which I find really interesting from an infrastructure perspective. Integration with big data comes through the addition of a feature called Polybase into SQL Server 2016. So I can build virtual data sets in SQL Server that are actually being derived from a Hadoop system as their source and issue T-SQL statements against them and get result sets back. The advanced analytics space is one that's really interesting. SQL Server has added a number of new features. The first one, which is really key, is that I can now call R right from within Transact SQL. SQL Server has also fully integrated a multi-thread MPP server product for doing detailed data science work, and that is the R server. The other thing that's really interesting with 2016, and if you've been following Microsoft and their drive to the cloud, full integration between on-premise SQL Server and a number of features in Azure. I can leverage the economics and the elasticity of the cloud to extend functionality of the SQL Server and also to drive costs down. Disaster recovery also becomes key because not only can I have backups sitting there waiting to be restored, but I can actually make the backups in Azure, which means I don't have to push my large backups across the wire to get them up in Azure. The extension is probably the least well-defined, but one of the most interesting pieces of it. Hybrid cloud really gives me scale. Once I have that VPN created, I can do things like burst from on-premise to the cloud if I'm getting heavy load. If I want to have the servers out where the customers are, so I could put one piece of a farm in the European data centers, one in the Southeast Asian data centers, one in Australia, one in South America, one locally. And because everything is VPN connected and because everything is Active Directory authenticated, I can treat that as if I had multiple physical data centers that I was working with. I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. I hope you found it useful. If you do have questions, please reach out to me anytime. Thank you.